Thank you, Anna. Everyone can hear me okay, right? Yeah? Okay, great. Um, so as Anna said, my name is Shannon Chung. I'm from Rutgers University. I'm a PhD candidate at the School of Social Work there. I'll be presenting on behalf of my co-authors today. This presentation is basically an extension of an existing publication that we have in, it's published in Emerging Adulthood. And I'm glad to share the full publication with anybody who wants to see it at a later point. But yeah, so here we go. For this presentation, I'm going to be following this agenda here. I'm hoping to take around 15 to 20 minutes for the full presentation, to leave about 10 to 15 minutes for discussion or Q&A or anything like that. Okay, so to start, for the introduction, I'm going to introduce the background and then the research questions that guided our study. So to start, 1.25 million LGBTQ plus adult immigrants live in the United States. Despite this number, LGBTQ plus migrants are largely overlooked in migration literature, which follows the pattern for many other lines of research where the assumed participant or research subject is cisgender and or heterosexual. Even so, there are, of course, increasing numbers of LGBTQ plus individuals who are migrating to the US for various reasons, but one of them includes to find a place where their identities are safe, are protected, and where they can be themselves safely. Many of these LGBTQ plus adult immigrants in the US are between the ages of 18 and 29, 42% of them, in fact. And this is important because this time period is a critical period of development called emerging adulthood. During this time, conventional markers of adult status, at least in most cultures, are gradually attained. So this includes accepting responsibility of oneself, making independent decisions, and becoming financially independent. Arnett, who first described emerging adulthood in the late 90s, early 2000s, describes this period as characterized by identity exploration, instability, and feeling in between. So why is it important that, LGBTQ plus migrants haven't been focused on as much in migration literature? Well, they have fewer resources typically at their disposal than their cisgender and heterosexual counterparts. A lot of the literature has shown that important to migrant integration and acculturation in the US, or in any host country really, is the support of local diaspora communities. For LGBTQ plus migrants, however, they often face homophobia and transphobia from their diaspora communities, while also experiencing xenophobia and racism from their native-born LGBTQ plus communities. So that leaves very little social support available to them. I do want to note, however, that LGBTQ plus migrants do demonstrate exceptional resilience and resourcefulness, which is why it's important to study ways in which they're able to facilitate their own integration despite the scarcity of resources. So one line of migration literature has begun to shed light on how ICTs can help facilitate refugee integration, which may be especially salient for LGBTQ plus migrants who have fewer resources and also who seem to be much younger and likely to be digitally connected. So at present, there's little research on emerging adult LGBTQ plus migrants, again, despite the fact that emerging adulthood is such a critical period of development. So taking this background together, we used these research questions to guide our study. First, how do LGBTQ plus emerging adult migrants describe and understand their integration into host communities within the United States? And how do they use ICTs to facilitate their integration and promote their resilience? Methods is broken up into recruitment, data collection, and data analysis. So first, we recruited our study sample by conducting outreach through service and advocacy organizations throughout the US. This included any orgs that served LGBTQ plus people, migrants, or the cross-section of LGBTQ plus migrants. I emailed out flyers and asked folks to share with their clients, share with within their networks. And I also engaged in paid advertisement through social media, through Facebook and Instagram in particular. Recruitment took place from September 2020 to March 2021, which also happens to be around peak COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm happy to share about that experience and any challenges along the way. So interested folks were asked to contact us via study email, and then they were screened for eligibility. So the eligibility criteria are listed here on the slide. They have to be between ages 18 and 25, which is the age range that is theorized for emerging adulthood. They had to identify as LGBTQ plus or having a diverse sexual orientation and or gender identity. They had to have migrated recently, and we defined that as within the past 5 years. And finally, they had to be comfortable communicating in English, since the interviews were conducted by myself, an English speaker. For participation, the study participants were given a $40 Amazon e-gift card. So the data were collected in semi-structured interviews with each participant, and they lasted between 1 and 2 hours. They were recorded through Zoom and then transcribed using a professional transcription service. Some of the prompts that we use to interview the participants are here on the slide. For example, could you tell me about your use of ICTs before migration, as well as after you migrated and until now? And ICTs for these participants were defined as any sort of like social media, web applications, the internet, etc. Prior to the interview, participants were also asked to fill out a demographic questionnaire, which asked them about their age, immigration status, country of origin, sexuality and gender, and a couple other things such as which ICTs do you use and housing, security, things like that. So to analyze the data, we used constructivist grounded theory, which views reality as subjective by considering how the research and participant interact with one another to shape the data as well as the analysis. Constructivist grounded theory is also important here because it centers participants' experiences. So to begin analysis, I openly coded the first 5 interviews that were conducted, and this led to the development of an initial codebook. Myself and another RA, as well as another co-author, met together to discuss this initial codebook, as well as identify additional codes that needed to be explored through the remaining interviews. After all the interviews were completed, the remaining transcripts were also coded, and the co-authors, myself included, met to review the codes as well as refine them. Once we got to refined codes, we created categories and themes and made sure that we kept refining these themes until we met in mutual agreement about them. Okay. So some strategies for methodological rigor here included negative case analysis, acknowledging our positionalities, member checking, where we emailed the participants with the themes that we had created and asked them if these were representative of their experiences, and if not, they were invited to share their feedback. The participants in this study who contacted us back after we emailed them the themes all said that the themes were consistent with their experiences. I believe there were 18 of them. So finally, we used an audit trail to document the processes and decisions that we made along the way. So for results, I'm going to start by describing the sample demographics. As with any qualitative study, these are context bound. And so it's really important to understand who participated in this study. And then I'll talk about the 4 themes that we found during analysis. So overall, we had 37 participants in the study sample. Their average age was 23.2 years old, and they came from 14 different countries of origin, with the most coming from Kenya at 14 participants, or 37% of the whole sample. Now, we didn't ask where participants were living in the US to protect their privacy, but in many of the interviews, they did mention where they were based. So these included Delaware, Florida, North Carolina, etc. The rest are listed here on this slide. So I'm not going to read every single number that appears on this slide. However, I do want to note that the sexual orientation that was most represented within our sample was gay, with over half of them identifying as gay. And then as far as gender identity goes, the sample was mostly represented by cisgender people. Particularly cisgender men, who made up almost half of the sample, and then followed by cisgender women. As far as immigration status goes, 45.9%, or 17, were what used to be called green card holders, or permanent residents in the US. And then this was followed by the rest, including student visa, asylum seeker, undocumented. A couple didn't know what their immigration status was, and then 2 said they were US citizens. So with that, we'll get into the themes that came up in data analysis. So the first theme is called balancing identity exploration with identity concealment when using ICTs in the country of origin. So if you imagine the migration trajectory, we are pre-migration right now. Participants' use of ICTs in their country of origin was very integral to their LGBTQ+ identity development. And this was true of participants regardless of their sexuality, their gender, as well as their country of origin. Now, I mentioned country of origin here because there were participants who migrated to the US from countries where there were legal protections for LGBTQ+ people, but they still relied on ICTs for their identity development and to find a safe space for them to learn about their own sexuality or gender identity. These participants reported encountering homophobia and transphobia from their family and from their own community members. So instead, they turned to ICTs, which offered positive representations of, as well as accurate information about sexuality and gender identity. The ICTs were also important for participants to find others who were like them, and so that they could connect with a community that welcomed them. So for example, in this quote, Lan, a 25-year-old bisexual woman, shares that she used Facebook groups to look for people who were accepting of her. And because of this, she described social media as another home within home. Now, this theme is characterized by identity development, but also this need to balance the use of ICTs with identity concealment. Using ICTs in this way was not without its risks, especially for participants who were living in countries where being LGBTQ plus was particularly stigmatized, or even where there was state-sanctioned violence against people with diverse sexual orientations or gender identities. Almost 1/5 of the participants shared that they needed to keep their internet activity hidden or concealed because they were afraid of being discovered or found out. Now, one participant, for example, talked about how when he used a dating website for gay men, each time somebody messaged him or he got a notification, he would close everything on his computer, turn everything off, because he was afraid that someone would track his IP address and discover him. In the quote on this slide, Michael, a 25-year-old gay man, shared that this perceived danger was informed by a very real threat of homophobic violence. Here he talks about how there are people who will actively go on these dating websites or dating apps and look for people to victimize, to rob, and to attack or assault. This is a very stark juxtaposition against the previous slide where Lan described that social media was a home within a home. Here, Michael's sharing that this very stark reality that participants were wary of the danger that they were still in, even though they were in virtual spaces that were supposed to be for them. So theme 2 is called Relying on ICTs to Prepare for Migration to the United States. In short, ICTs allowed participants to imagine what their futures could look like in a place where their identities were accepted. Over half of the sample, 22 participants, said that they used ICTs to research the US while living in their respective countries of origin. So ICTs played a very key role in their image of the US as this safe haven for the opportunities it represented as far as being LGBTQ plus goes. So here, Pat, for example, who's a 22-year-old gay trans man, learned that he could live more openly as a transgender man in the US on the internet. So this is what made him decide to migrate at an early age. Similarly, Willie, a 23-year-old transgender gay man, decided that he had wanted to migrate to the US when he was quite young. He says that he had been doing the research for almost 17 years and eventually decided that it was time for him to move. He talked about relying on the internet to learn how to navigate the US immigration process. So theme 3 is titled Using ICTs to Find Housing, Work, and Friends in the United States. Importantly, ICTs were used by 19 participants to secure either housing or employment prior to even migrating to the United States. This was important for easing their resettlement and facilitating their integration. So here on this slide, Sam, a 22-year-old bisexual man, talks about how he secured housing online and had he actually said in the interview that he had never spoken to this person or met this person in real life once he had moved here. He found housing online and it was settled. Another participant, Jake, had a similar experience to secure housing, but during our interview, he reflected that he was lucky that nothing happened. He described it in retrospect as a quote, sketchy situation, and it was very uncertain for him. He realized that he had placed his full trust in a stranger who had posted a housing listing. He had never met him, and he was very desperate, he said, to at least find a place to sleep at night, that he didn't think twice about it. So this next quote reflects the key role that ICTs had in helping participants find employment. 16 participants relied on ICTs to help them find employment. For example, some used Craigslist to find on-demand and informal work. Others were using rideshare apps such as Lyft or Uber and driving during the pandemic for an income. In the face of financial challenges, participants like Bob, a 24-year-old gay man, used ICTs to support themselves by finding clients for whatever work that they were doing. In this case, Bob was doing sex work so that he could support himself. The last theme, drawbacks of using ICTs in the United States, is in contrast to the previous three themes. So far, I've discussed that ICTs have had a positive role for identity development, migration, and resettlement. But participants did share about some of the challenges that they encountered when using ICTs. Over a third of the participants talked about exposure to online harassment and how seeing homophobic, transphobic, and racist comments negatively affected their mental health. In this quotation, Luke talked about his experience, where he's seeing people that he knows and people that he's close with from his country of origin saying harmful and hateful things about LGBTQ plus people. He also talks about the effect of seeing strangers do the same, and how, whether he knows them or not, it has a toll on his mental health. In addition to harassment and abuse, participants were vulnerable to misinformation, disinformation, and fraud. Beginning with both misinformation and disinformation, a lot of participants had described feeling very overwhelmed with the volume of information that was available to them on the internet. One participant had explained that it was like drinking from a hose, because he didn't know what was reliable information, who to trust. There was a lot of uncertainty about what was the most updated information regarding immigration processes, which can have an effect on whether you're able to stay here legally, at least. About 1/3 of the participants had said that they were worried about being scammed or victimized, but also felt that they had few choices when it came to housing and employment. Excuse me. One of the participants, Fred, a 25-year-old bisexual transgender man, talked about his own experience trying to find work on Craigslist. So here he talks about how he was trying to find a job, and the original poster for the Craigslist post had said that he needed to pay him money before he could get hired and earn his own money. Fred talks about how he's new to the country. He doesn't know anything about American culture, and he didn't know the ways here, and whether this was a common practice. At the same time, he had no job and had no way of making money. And so at the end of this quote here, he says that you just have to pay him and try your luck, and hopefully it ends up in a job. And so those are the 4 themes. My discussion is going to be broken up into key points and policy recommendations. So a common thread here is that ICTs were integral to the whole migration trajectory for participants, both before and after migration, where participants were preparing for migration to the US, looking for housing, looking for employment, getting adjusted to the culture, as well as learning about the immigration process. And this is in contrast to existing theories and conceptualizations of migration, where people have typically expected that integration happens where integration happens after arriving in the host or destination country. So a main question for a policy recommendation here is how can we harness ICTs to support LGBTQ plus migrants, especially those who are emerging adults. The LGBTQ plus migrants of the study demonstrated an affinity for using ICTs to access information. And this was essential for them to prepare for their migration to the US. At the same time, they were at risk of victimization, specifically fraud victimization, and they needed to depend heavily on potentially unreliable online resources. So I have here that, government entities can increase their reach and support to LGBTQ plus emerging adult migrants by streamlining the information available online, creating a greater presence, perhaps consider user interface and user experience when navigating their websites, especially for non-English speaking individuals. In addition to this, increasing funding for local organizations who serve migrants and LGBTQ plus people in order to improve their own websites and social media campaigns to disseminate official and vetted information. Hopefully reducing the need for LGBTQ plus migrants to rely on informal community groups and just strangers on the internet. And so here are the references that I used for this presentation in particular. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take questions. I have a QR code for the publication, and here is my email if anyone wants the paper or has additional questions that I can't answer today.
Thank you, Shannon, for your insights on this topic. I don't think we have questions, but it's gonna stay recorded for other people to listen.
Great.
So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Anna.
Have a great day.
You too.